All right, chapter 9 of The Air We Breathe. We are in our next to last chapter. So the book is kind of winding up, and I think maybe you could sense that as you were reading the chapter. The chapter felt like a summary is building, dots are being connected, lines are starting to intersect and come together. So this chapter, as a matter of fact, kind of finish this last few pages, not just on the issue at hand, but drawing from all of the other chapters and starting to say this is the culmination of living in a culture formed by the gospel, but who has forgotten where its formation has come from. One of the one of the metaphors that got used multiple times was about like the sea level, when the water recedes, and that kind of the sense of the Christian presence within the culture has been a receding tide. It's pulling out and away. It's not as deep as it used to be. It's not as close as it used to be. And the interesting thing about low tide is sometimes seeing what's underneath. The stuff that low tide leaves behind, and it's been there the whole time, you just couldn't see it. But if you've ever been to the beach that has kind of a pretty significant tide one way or the other, I'm not talking about something that's super fast or crazy, but just when we've gone to beach weekend at Cocoa or maybe just one of the Gulf beaches. But depending on the time of day, if you're there long enough, you might have to move your seating. Like if you got there and the tide was sort of out, maybe you were sitting in a spot like, oh, now we're going to get wet unless we move back. Or you were relatively close and the tide goes out and you feel like you're pretty far away from the water. But it's always interesting to me what's left behind. And sometimes it's just a topography of the sands. Divots and holes and things, places where later on, when the tide is back in, it's like, oh, that's a sandbar. And now I can see how there's a trough in the ground and then it comes back up again. But that just felt like deep water and a sandbar. But you can't tell some of these things until the water has receded. But it's not nothing maybe to carry that metaphor slightly further and just to say that one of the natures of tides is they go out, but they come back in. So I think there's no fundamental rationale to assume that things only go in one direction. The tide of Christian faith will only ever lessen. But history, even within this country, has actually shown periods of change where the tide has come back in and it gone back out and back in and back out. So who knows? God only knows. So our quote, and I've just decided why not go ahead and read the quote every time because it's usually very well connected to the chapter, and it's a good starting off point. I can't breathe from George Floyd, and it's very difficult to consider such a concise statement that has had a bigger impact on our culture over the past 10 years or so. Something that would happen in a town in the Midwest. I mean, it's a city, so it was Minneapolis, right? And that's a big city, but a singular event would become so ubiquitous. And being, living in America, us maybe not perceiving the impact that had overseas as well. There were demonstrations and there were riots and there were issues all over the world. And that is just this kind of really remarkable thing to see world-changing history unfold, and with the realization maybe that it can come from some very unexpected places. We expect world-shaking history, something that has like this, making big changes to be sort of obviously significant. A war or a big peace treaty or an election or an assassination or a march, whatever is, some kind of event you could almost plan. You might not know exactly how much of an impact it's going to have, but you can kind of look and assume it's going to have a big impact. We just have to see what it is. But this was like a random day, and it was ostensibly a pretty random arrest. And yet it led to not just the death of one person, but all sorts of things and we've kind of touched on a few of them in these other chapters, like the removal of statues and the renaming of buildings and all this kind of stuff. In something like marital counseling, there is a maxim that the argument over the toothpaste, like who let the cap off the toothpaste tube, is never about the toothpaste tube. Like couples will fight about relatively minor things, and the issue is not that one minor, that's just a presenting issue. They're actually arguing about 20 other things that have happened, but the toothpaste tube was either the straw that broke the camel's back, or it's the presenting issue where something was about to come to head anyway, and this is the moment where it's fine, now it's on. This is a reason to unleash all of my frustrations, or to give a catalog of all of the offenses, or to say all these things have been annoying me or frustrating me or making me angry so much and for so long. So I think in some ways, we can look at the George Floyd issue as being, either the straw that broke the camel's back or the toothpaste tube that's never about the toothpaste tube, it's about everything else. All, past injustices, other police-involved deaths, a history of racial tensions and injustices, all the sort of stuff wrapped up in once. And then sometimes it just takes a precipitating factor. It takes a flashpoint, it takes a moment, it takes something, and then everything that was under the surface all finds its spot to escape. The most efficient shape to hold volume is a sphere. It's round, ball, because when you have, say, like air in a balloon or gas in a bubble, it's pushing out in all directions at the same time. And so the sphere then contains all of that pressure equalized the same amount in every direction at once in 3 dimensions, right? But you take one needle and stick it in one spot. All of that pressure, which has been equalized in every direction and forming the sphere, forming the ball, all shoots out that convenient hole, and the whole thing just goes pop. So, that seems to me that that's kind of what we are looking in retrospect, a random arrest in a Midwestern city sparking riots in Germany. Really? Who would have anticipated that beforehand? And yet these can be the after effects of when one moment allows for all the pressure in a system to come out in that one spot. So I thought Scribner was, and again, for being an Australian writing to mostly English audience, had some very insightful comments about the after effects of George Floyd's death, of the Black Lives Matter movement, of the protests, of the all of the things that were surrounding that. One of the things that I that I think was very rightly pointed upon was there was an iconography that developed surrounding the image of George Floyd. There was a picture of this guy that no one knew beforehand. And suddenly his face, and there was kind of it was like a particular view of his face became like well known throughout the world. And it was drawn as graffiti. It was painted on the side of walls. It was put onto T-shirts. That is a form of iconography where an image is conveying meaning, symbolic meaning. And many of these had like this very messianic or very saintly aspects added to the picture. You may have seen, I remember seeing them. Some of it was graffiti or some of it was on like signs and placards, but there was the nimbus, which is sort of like that flat disc golden halo that you could see in medieval iconography behind a saint. Maybe there were some that were actual like little circular halos as well, but or bathed in golden light or with wings, or adding these other symbolic elements to convey this very specific meaning. That this wasn't just a death, it was a murder, and it wasn't just a murder, it was a martyrdom. Once again, here is a very random arrest in a Midwestern city, and it's now being proclaimed martyrdom in a way that is like impacting the entire world. So it's very powerful images, very powerful thoughts. And Scrivener is pointing to this, that even as people were making these sometimes implicit and sometimes explicit connections to George Floyd and a saint, or George Floyd and Jesus, or we are now tapping into something within the West that's right underneath the surface. We're tapping into a culture that has been formed by the story of Jesus, by what is referred to in Isaiah 53 in a messianic prophecy as the suffering servant. Those are the passages that we get, especially in Holy Week or throughout Lent, about like a sheep led before its shearers, he was mute and opened not his mouth. Or by his transgressions we are healed. Through his stripes, he was wounded for our transgressions. The iniquities of us all were laid upon him. By his stripes we were healed. That image, those meanings, that story is formative to our worldview throughout the West. It's our story, but its connection has been lost for so many people. Why do we identify so sympathetically and profoundly with a victim? Prior to that, remember, we've dealt with this in other chapters. You did not want to be a victim. Victims were the worst. Being a victim was miserable, and it was lowly and dishonorable. And if it wasn't directly your fault, it was at least your consequence that nobody wanted to suffer. That's you avoid that. But now it is a part of our story in a way that we cannot pull away from or cut out. That there is some deep and profound honor in victimhood, this victimhood of Jesus done in love on behalf of the world. But now, divorced from the person and the history of Jesus, we live in a culture that still values victimhood, but doesn't have the connection of what that victimhood meant or what it was for or what it accomplishes. And we now have great sympathy for people who suffer. We have a desire for people who are being victimized to be protected or uplifted or cared for. But that sympathy, again, it's not natural. It's not universal, and it's not inarguable. It comes from somewhere, because there was a lot of human history that did not have sympathy for the victim. If you were weak, that's your fault. If the stronger person could take it from you, well, then get stronger or don't have something they want. Our very sympathies for people who are at the bottom, on the margins, in need, weak, helpless. Remember, the West comes from various cultures that when the baby didn't look strong enough, they left him on the mountainside to die. So, how do we come so far from eliminate the weak and the needy to go out of your way to do something for the weak and the needy? And that's the gospel. That is the life of Christ. It is the scriptural vision from the beginning to the end. It's the Mosaic law. It's all of God's purposes for us that have just been so ingrained. This is the tide that has shaped the topography of the ground, that even if it recedes, you still see all its effects. You just might not know where they've come from. If you've never seen the tide when it was full, and all you see is now, you don't realize what happened to put that hole there. The geologists will tell us that the Grand Canyon was flat, and over millions of years, it was cut by the Colorado River. Well, when you look at it now, you can't see a river that's big enough to do any of that. Glaciers receded and gouged out deep, parts of the earth, and the river cut through rock and stone. But now the Grand Canyon is just this massive expanse, and the Colorado River just sort of runs through it like a little ribbon. So you could look at it and have no concept of what would have done that work, because we weren't there to see when it looked different. And I think that's kind of where we are with him pointing out a lot of the reflexive sympathies, the reflexive criticisms, the reflexive priorities of the culture. And they were formed in Scripture. But as the culture pulled away, it doesn't know where these things came from anymore, and therefore doesn't know what to do with them. I thought I marked this little passage because I think this felt very, a good summary of not just this one issue, but kind of how we've gotten to this point. Consider equality. Once steep moral hierarchies were the norm, now we want to root out inequalities whenever we find them. Consider compassion. Once pity for the undeserving was considered a weakness, now we consider it a virtue. Consider consent. Once powerful men could possess the bodies of whomever they pleased, now we name this as the abuse that it is. Consider enlightenment. Once education was a luxury for rich men, now we consider it a necessity for all. Consider science. Once knowledge of the natural world was based on the assertions of the authorities, now we hold the powerful to account and we seek to test the claims against objective standards. Consider freedom. Once it was assumed that certain classes of people could be enslaved, now we consider that kind of idea a blasphemy. Consider progress. Once history was thought of as a descent from a golden age, now we feel that the arc of history bends, or it should bend, towards justice. And every one of those coming from the biblical worldview, that as fewer and fewer people know where they come from, we are left with its effects, but with no idea how it ought to be applied. Or without the proper guidance, applying it wrongly. Again, when we live in a culture where your the moral framework seems to bend based off of how victimized you are, how many ways you can point to oppression, therefore you gain some moral superiority of others, then we have gotten completely backwards what used to be the biblical virtue of raising up those who were weak, to now weakness is so honored, it's competitive. Who is weaker than another? Because the weakness gives you a completely different sense of power over and above other people. The inversion that gets pointed to in a couple of places here within this chapter reminds me very much of how we've moved in 60 years from the goal being to be judged not on the color of our skin, but on the content of our character, to the color of our skin is the content of our character. It's happened very swiftly, but our culture has moved very, very quickly over the past, 10, 15 years, whatever it's been. And it feels more racially divided than it did 20 or 30 years ago. And to be able to, I remember, I'm old enough with all this gray hair to remember when the goal was color blindness. And the virtue behind it was, this is Dr. King's vision. This is as referenced here, the promissory note of the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal. We want that to be fulfilled. Therefore, you ought to be judged as an equal under the law and under society. And, regardless of what you look like, it's how you behave. And that's going to be the difference maker. It feels like a very steep regression to say that the most important part of someone is an outward appearance or an immutable physical characteristic. That certain skin tones are good and certain skin tones are bad, or certain skin tones give you some sort of ability to argue for a moral high ground, and some skin tones mean that you bear a guilt and responsibility that can never be absolved. This is a pretty substantial change of events, but it's taking the same foundational virtue. People should not be exploited. People should be treated fairly. People should be treated justly, no matter who they are or where they're from. But once removed from, this is, as I mentioned, from the baptismal covenant, that one line about respecting the dignity of every human being. It's a fair and it's a true and it's a right statement, but if it's removed from everything else in the baptismal covenant and it's placed in a position of priority, what does it mean? What does it mean to respect someone's dignity? If we are not making a reference to, as we get from this British doctor in the chapter, who was it a crime that he was convicted of, or was it a civil matter? I don't recall. But it was a transgender issue, and the doctor did not want to refer to the 6-foot guy with a beard as she, and was making reference to Genesis. God created the male and female in his image. This sense of the dignity of humanity because we are made in the image of God. Once that's removed, then you can still agree that we ought to respect the dignity of every human being, but now dignity has lost something essential in understanding what it is and where we got it, and therefore why it ought to be respected and how to respect it. Yeah.
At the bottom of, can't read the number, I think it's 936. 1/3, I don't know. Anyway, where you're considered.
Yes.
Reading from, there's a sentence. I think about it. Okay, the word weird applied.
Weird, yes.
Well, that paragraph, I put a question mark.
Okay, so remember, he brought that concept of weird very, very early on in the book. And it's an acronym that it's not his personally, that has been used by historians and sociologists, but it's like a Western, enlightened, or is it educated? What's I? Industrialized. What's R? I don't know. D is like democratic, I think. Anyway, it's just a catch-all phrase for the sort of society that we live in and that is common.
The next sentence, what that starts with, but.
Okay.
But with these morals in place, I'm sorry, man, I did not get helping this morning. We are forholding.
But with these morals in place, we have found that we can discard institutional Christianity, yet carry on with the moral life.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. So you discard the Christianity, but you keep some of its precepts.
Yeah.
Yes. Right. And that's been kind of the project of modernism, is to pick and choose what it finds to be sensible and discard the rest. So, and this is, when I say modernism, remember that it's a somewhat technical term that means a particular era and it means a particular mindset. We would, I think, be easily considered in the postmodern era. So modern doesn't just mean now. Modern meant, we're talking about, something that happened kind of late industrial revolution to, it's usually tagged around the 80s or 90s, but certainly most of the 20th century be considered the modern era. And there was very much an idea within modernity that said, we are this close to figuring everything out. And if we apply the proper scientific mindset, we can solve all of our problems. The problem was they didn't really understand science very well either. That's where you had what was considered literally progressive as a tenet of the Progressive Party, and the people who promoted this were self-proclaimed progressives in the 20s, were all about eugenics, breeding the superior races so that the inferior races would eventually just wither away and humanity as a whole would improve and evolve. We hear that now and we think that's not just crazy talk, but it's this leads to the ovens. And it did. The talk of eugenics, which was kicked around in like high society, even in America, was there's a straight line to the Holocaust and a final solution of eliminating the undesirables. The Jews, the gypsies, the homosexuals, the intellectuals, anyone that we have deemed as inferior to whoever we have deemed to be superior, that science will prove is superior. Therefore, that's the genetic material that needs to continue on and blah, blah, blah. And humanity must be purified, and we'll do this in a very scientific fashion, without going too deep down the Nazi rabbit hole. but they were very much like this. Everything is scientifically based. Everything from our decision-making process to how we are carrying it out was going to be at the pinnacle of progress and what, you know, they were able to achieve. It was murder on an industrial scale. How to be as efficient in killing people as possible. So the horror that happens when you assume that you are this close to figuring out everything. So where was I going with modernity? We were talking about pulling out the tenets of what you like from Christianity. So modernity had this element of, we will take the things that we think are useful or helpful about Christianity and we will discard the rest. He has subsequently died and now knows God's truth. A bishop within our church who gained a lot of notoriety, especially in the 80s, who seemed to really enjoy publicly not just criticizing, but trying to eliminate what we would consider relatively common doctrines of the church. The virgin birth, ridiculous. Resurrection, stupid. The incarnation of Jesus through the indwelling Holy Spirit and Mary, nonsense. That he had a rational explanation for each of them to demythologize the faith. Now, drawing a check and a pension as a bishop of the church, but systematically teaching against what felt like almost every major doctrine, with the sense of this will make Christianity more sensible to the modern mind. There's a quotation from this particular bishop that I don't remember well enough to quote verbatim, but the gist of it was, modern man who can turn the lights on by flipping a switch cannot possibly believe in a virgin birth. Therefore, you have to get rid of this supernatural stuff, because we obviously know now, we enlightened ones, we wise ones, we modern thinkers know better. So we're going to take the good from Christianity. We're going to take elements of compassion, elements of justice, elements of, whatever it might be. But then we're going to get rid of all this extra stuff, which is obviously dumb. And we will produce a more enlightened modern faith. We have seen this project carry out in a variety of ways. But this is, oh gosh, which Niebuhr brother said this? There were two famous American theologians, Reinhard and Ronald Niebuhr. And the one of them that wrote Christ and Culture, where he was basically setting up, he was kind of describing the ways in which the Christian faith existed within and through a specific culture. And he described a variety of ways: Christ with culture, where it kind of cooperates; Christ above culture, where the faith is more important than your surrounding culture; culture above Christ, vice versa. And he's just kind of talking about the various ways that people integrate or do not integrate their faith within their daily life. He described the modern church with, it's a super good quote that I won't get right, because again, I don't remember the exacts, but it's like they preached a Christ without a cross, and shucks, it's a really good quote. But he was critiquing a more modern Christianity that by eliminating all of the supernatural stuff, it actually was nonsense. It made no sense anymore, because everything that made the stuff you like sensible, you removed the foundation from underneath it, and it's just it's meaningless. The a God without wrath and a Christ without a cross and man without sin, something, something, something. It's really good. Look it up at some point. But so by removing load-bearing walls, you think you're opening the room up. Oh, it's so much brighter in here now that I took that wall down. Oh, this open floor plan. This is so extravagant. This is really, uh-oh. That wall was there for a reason, and it was supporting the roof. And now the structure is unsound and the roof is collapsing in. You did something for an aesthetic purpose without thinking about its structural engineered needs. And this is one, I'm just full of quotes today, I guess. G.K. Chesterton has this great little illustration about fences, about how you should never take a fence down before you know why it was put up in the first place. It's really easy to see something and destroy it. That's easy. Anybody can do that. Anybody can break something. But by saying, oh, that's a weird place for a fence, just get rid of it. Well, it's possible that there's a reason you didn't foresee and you're really going to regret getting rid of it later. Just because you don't see the reason doesn't mean there isn't one. And sometimes through the wisdom of the ancients, through trial and error, through experience, someone has put something in a place that even though you can't see it, it really is significant. So as these elements of the faith are removed, what we're left with, law and gospel are intended to work together in a particular fashion. And within the church, we argue what that is. And the strict Lutherans have a particular take that's different than the Roman Catholics, that's different than blah, 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 whatever. But everyone within the church who has encountered the gospel and wrestled with the scriptures sees something about God's justice and God's mercy, that there is righteousness and there is grace, there is law and there is gospel, and that relationship may be paradoxical, that relationship may be mysterious, that relationship may be, difficult to pin down in a way where our finite brains can really wrap our heads around, but there is a relationship there. So if you pull them apart, you are left with something that by itself not only doesn't make any sense, but could become very destructive. Justice without mercy is severe and harsh, and that's cutting off the hands of people, that's throwing people in jail because I can, that is punishing people because whether or not they're guilty, this will scare off someone from doing something bad. That is, throw them in prison or hang them for stealing the loaf of bread for the hungry child kind of stuff. Mercy without justice ignores the cries of the hurt and the oppressed and the needy. It just says, no, everything's okay and you're okay and I'm okay. And it doesn't matter that you did this horrific thing that has lifelong consequences for someone else. But as long as you feel good about it. Mercy without justice makes no demands on our life to change, to be better, to rectify our mistakes, to learn, to grow. Mercy, just straight mercy, like, whatever, it becomes this open licentiousness. Do whatever you want, do whatever feels good, because nothing is actually wrong, or at least nothing is wrong enough to have any kind of consequence about it. So those two were intended like body and soul to be together. You rip them apart, and neither one of them will accomplish what it was intended to do. And it could be like the load-bearing wall. You remove it, and the whole thing collapses. Every little dichotomy that I kind of threw out there somewhat offhandedly is like that, justice and mercy and law and gospel, righteousness and grace, all of these things, they not only fit together as a balance, like, oh, you need a little bit of one, a little bit of the other. They actually fit together even deeper than that, kind of inextricably, like they only make sense in relation to one another. What is grace without understanding the violation of the law that should come with consequence, but that consequence is not forgotten, it's redeemed, it's forgiven, it's restored. To say that grace is the unmerited favor of God. Well, why wouldn't he have favor on you? Why not? What do you mean unmerited? Why wouldn't you merit it? If there is no sin, then there is no need for a Christ. This came up in a different conversation, but it was about a week ago on something totally different. Some of the medieval scholastics had a saying as they were trying to think through the doctrines of the faith as deeply as possible. Oh, happy fall, meaning the Genesis story of Adam and Eve was a joyful occasion. For if Adam had not fell, there would have been no need for a Messiah. Therefore, Christ would not have been incarnate. So the fall itself was this positive, oh, happy fall. We're really glad that you sinned and you broke the world because we get the benefit of God restoring us. And there's an internal logic to that, but ultimately, like maybe not break things the first time, like maybe that was not God's intention for us, regardless of how aware he was of it happening. But we were not created in order to sin. That is our failing. Though it may lead to good, it only leads to good because God's goodwill is always done with us or in spite of us. Isn't with us better? Sure would have avoided a lot of pain and suffering and destruction and terror. And that's like, when my house burned down, I really appreciated how my neighbors were there to put an arm around me, and they gave me a cup of hot chocolate, and they said, I'm there for you. And that part was really, really sweet. Okay, but was that really worth having your house burned down for? No. Could you have gotten that same thing a different way that was maybe less catastrophic? I hope so. So when these elements are plucked and picked from the faith and the rest of it is discarded because it's not sensible or it's too supernatural or it's too weird or whatever, a lot of these elements make no sense by themselves and they lead to very terrible places. The other spot that I marked, this is a really good quote from Charles Spurgeon. He said, "Be half a Christian and you shall have enough religion to make you miserable." So what happened when half of a Christian, when you only take Christ as an example and not a redeemer, then the bar set is so high and so impossible, it becomes painful and destructive. That's all law and no gospel. But if you go all gospel and no law, the gospel itself makes no sense. Why do I need good news? I have no bad news to make a comparison or have a need for something good. It's only good news if there's bad news first. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. But For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten. Like those fit together. There's a quote that was so good. This is a straight up Scrivener quote. But I took a picture of the book and I sent it to a couple of friends, a couple of colleagues that I've been saying, hey, this is a really good book. You should consider with your own parishes. I don't remember which page. I took the picture and I texted it to him. We used to think that without God, all things are permitted. That was a line from the novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky, put in the mouth of one of the characters over 140 years ago. Many have believed this sentiment, whether they are inside or outside the church. It seems logical that without God and without the constraints of organized religion, society might enjoy greater freedom. It turns out we enjoy finger wagging even more. Without God, it's not that everything is permitted. Instead, everything is preachy, painfully so. We have a far less influence of the church and scripture on society as a whole right now than we did, 20 years ago, 50 years ago, whatever. I don't think that's an arguable point. Contemporary society is so moralistic and preachy. We are constantly being told you're not doing good enough, you are responsible for these terrible things, you've got to do better, you've got to be better. If you say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing, there are going to be constant people are going to shun you. You might get canceled. There is this, we live in an extremely polarized political age where if you don't toe your party's line, you are cast out into the darkness as being an enemy. Like, this is, once again, I'm not
Be sure to get every medical, get the word, injection that the government recommends to you.
right.
And don't.
Right, and recommend is that's a very mild term for what some of this was. During COVID when the vaccines first came out, there were large swaths of industries that said, if you do not take this medicine that has been raced through all approvals, if you don't take it, you will be out of work.
Yeah.
Now, before that starts to sound like a conspiracy theorist, let me point out one of those industries. We were told by our bishop, you will be vaccinated or you will not serve. Now, the justification behind it was very sensible in the manner of, look, the Episcopal Church, even in our diocese, has an overabundance of the demographic which is most susceptible to the virus: the elderly, the infirm, the people with weakened immune systems, all the people who were the most susceptible to this. We are more like that than even societies at large. You cannot effectively minister to people if you are endangering them. And you cannot effectively minister to the congregation that you have without being around them. So you must be around them to minister to them, and you cannot endanger them by being around them. Therefore, now I can follow that logic and I can follow the sensibility to it. And ultimately, that's coming from a pastoral desire to protect people and yet still minister effectively, which that's kind of like, that's the job of the clergy. But what it came down to was every single one of you will be vaccinated, period, the end. Now, I didn't have an issue with it. I don't know, though, if I had colleagues who did. Maybe there was somebody who had an issue with it. Maybe there's somebody who didn't want to be forced into taking something that they didn't know what it was going to do to them short-term or long-term. Maybe there was somebody who, in their own immunocompromised state, this wasn't a good idea for a variety of reasons. I don't know if there were, I don't recall if there were medical exemptions or if you could opt out somehow, but it was very clearly these are the things that you're going to do. We were not, you guys remember this, we were not permitted to be in person for months. The second Sunday of Lent, 2020 was our last Sunday, and we immediately went on an empty campus until Pentecost.
Yeah.
On Pentecost Sunday, we were allowed to have meetings. And then it was like super regulated about how many people could be there, how far apart they had to sit. We had to get people to sign up in advance. Do you remember having to do that?
Yeah.
Having to make a reservation to show up to a particular service? And what was intended to protect the most vulnerable to this virus hurt the most vulnerable to the virus. And people were left in their homes, and the elderly were alone. We had people in our congregation dying in hospitals and nursing homes, and their families could not touch them. I mean, it's crazy to think about it. At the time, once again, it's like there was a sentiment attached to it. There's a reason attached to it that made sense, but it was also divorced from a wider context. And the wider context might have changed some of these things. Like if the only thing you're worried about is safety, well, then don't do anything. Safety is good. But if that is the pinnacle priority, then never do anything because the world is unsafe. But we're always making judgments about what risks we're willing to take and what the trade-off and the consequence would be. It would be a risk to have a family member be in a hospital room or into a nursing home and be around that patient. That was a risk. But what was lost? You want to remind yourself of a heartbreaking story. Go ask Linda France about how her husband died alone, and how, as he was suffering from dementia and in the memory care unit and unable to see his family, kept asking, "Why can't I see them? Why can't I see them?" And no matter how many times it was explained, he wasn't going to remember. All he knew was he was alone, and she had to just wait. And that was a miserable, miserable time. So the very first Sunday we were open, you know who's the first people to show up? Kit and Evelyn Duncan. At the time, they were just about the oldest people in the congregation, and both of their health were terrible.
Yeah.
But they came tottering down that aisle day one, as soon as we were open for business. And that was pointing to, like, the ethic of safety is significant, but the ethic of community and worship and the presence of God and one another was more substantial. But when you remove the church, when you remove the gospel, when you remove scripture, all you're left with are just like the rules and regulations. Be safe. Don't do that. Do this instead. That's not sensible. That's not a good risk. And yet, what did we do, and what were the consequences of some of these decisions that seemed eminently justifiable at the time, but I think look more and more regrettable as we consider the past?
Hope that can be remembered.
I hope so, because it won't be the last crisis.
No.
There will always be another crisis. But what we do with them, that's always the telling factor. So this is where we find ourselves. This is this chapter is summing up, and the book is starting to sum up. This is where we find ourselves. The vestiges of the faith are everywhere you look, and the fundamental assumptions about the world and life and priorities, it's all there. And as the tide has receded, everybody can see what has been under the water the whole time. They've just forgotten it used to be covered by water, and it was the water that made it look that way. So as these things have been removed, the tenets and the elements that are left, it's like having a tool that people have forgotten what it's for. And so they use it maybe in an inappropriate or unhelpful or a potentially destructive way. There's an old story in this is often used in like liturgics, that a new bride is making dinner for her husband. She's very proud that she is going to pass along this family recipe that was always very important to her growing up. And now that he's a part of the family, she wants him to feel that way. So she is making a roast, just like her mom used to make on Sundays. And so when she gets the roast, she cuts the roast in half, and then she puts it in the pot, and she puts the vegetables, and she gets all the stuff together. And the husband says, "Why did you cut that in half? I don't understand." And she said, "Because that's how you do it. You cut the roast in half, and then you put it in the pot, and you put the stuff around it." He says, "Okay, but why do you cut it in half? I mean, it's a roast. Can't it just be all the same?" But she said, "No, that's how you cook a roast. Listen, I watched my mother do this for 30 years. I know how to do this." So, "Okay, dear, I trust you." And so as soon as he's out of earshot, she calls her mother. She says, "Mom, why do we cut the roast in half?" And she said, "Because that's how you cook a roast." And she says, "But why?" "Well, because that's the way my mother did it. I watched my mother do it for 30 years, and that's how you do it." And so after she hangs up, the mother calls her mother, so the grandmother, to say, "Mom, why did you cut the roast in half?" "Oh, we were poor and our pot was small. And so I had to cut it in half to make it fit." So for generations, an activity was reenacted because it's essential to what we do, but because the meaning, the origin has been forgotten, it's being replicated year after year unnecessarily. There was nothing inherent about cutting it in half. It was a totally incidental thing. But because that's what's carried on, it's now become tradition. We have the traditions of our faith, at least bits and pieces of it, everywhere you look. And all these things that people are arguing about today, they're arguing on Christian terms. Remember that the issue about the doctor, and the doctor said, the transgender issue, and he's appealing to Genesis, and the guy's like, the judgment was how that violates human dignity. There is no human dignity without Genesis 1. So it's like these after effects are still there, but everyone has forgotten where it came from. And so they just do the mechanics over and over again. But because they don't understand where it came from, they don't understand what they're doing or why. And that is where we find ourselves as we start to wrap everything up. Anything else? Okay, we have just one more chapter left. We will hit chapter 10, which will, bring everything, I think, together into a good conclusion, and we will take a Christmas break afterward. So I will see everyone next Wednesday. All right. Yep.